The morning they sold her, her mother wore her best dress. Nora Caldwell stood in the upstairs hallway of her family's house in Abilene, her hand resting against the wallpaper her mother had ordered from a catalog out of St. Louis, pale roses on cream, a pattern chosen to signal prosperity to anyone who entered. She had not meant to stop there. She had only come down for water, her throat dry from a night of poor sleep, and she had paused on the landing when she heard her father's voice rise with a particular kind of pleasure she had learned, over 23 years, to associate with transactions. Calloway didn't even negotiate, her father was saying. The floorboards were thin in this house, thinner than her father's pride, and she could hear the ice shifting in the glasses below. I told him the figure, and he didn't say a word. Just nodded, wrote the bank draft on the spot. A draft? Her mother's voice carried the lift it always did when money entered a conversation. Wouldn't take it, her father said, and his tone shifted into something harder. Said he'd pay her keep for the month she travels, but he won't, and I'm giving you his exact words now. He won't pay a bride price because he won't buy a person. A pause. Strange man, but rich. Rich enough it doesn't matter what notions he carries around. Strange isn't the word I'd use for him. This voice was her sister Clara's. Sweet Clara, the one who had married well at 19, who wore her contentment like a bonnet. But honestly, Father, whoever he is, taking Nora off our hands is a mercy to us all. She's argued with every man in this county who tried to court her. She ran off the Hargrove boy by telling him his business practices were immoral to his face, at a dinner party. She was right about Hargrove, Nora said quietly, to no one, to the rose wallpaper. She'll either soften him, her father continued, with the calm of a man closing a ledger, or he'll finally manage what none of us could and put some sense into her. Either way, the ice shifted again. Either way, it's done. Her mother laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. That was the part that stayed with Nora as she climbed back up the stairs without the water. That was the part that sat in her chest like a stone through the 3 days of preparation and the loading of the wagon and the long journey west and into the mountains. Not cruelty, but relief. Simple, uncomplicated relief, as though a difficult season had finally passed. She told herself it did not matter. She had been telling herself things did not matter for 23 years, and she was getting quite good at it. The road into the mountains took 4 days by wagon, the last of them climbing through pine forest so dense the sky became a rumor above the trees. The hired driver, a weathered man named Hobbs who smelled of tobacco and offered no conversation, had been given instructions to deliver her to the Calloway ranch by Friday. He seemed to take this task with the gravity of a man transporting live ammunition, careful, a little wary, always watching the tree line. She did not know if this was because of her or because of the mountains. She had read what there was to read about Elias Calloway. Her father's study had yielded a single letter and the county land record she'd found in the courthouse the week prior, when she'd slipped away from her mother's last fitting and ridden to town alone, a thing that had caused its own domestic incident. The land record told her he ran 12,000 acres of high country ranch, ran cattle and horses both, employed a small crew year-round, and had been at the location for 9 years. The letter, which her father had left carelessly on his desk, said almost nothing. It was brief, formal, and signed with a hand that pressed hard into the paper, the letters deliberate. He was not a man who wasted words on paper, she'd thought. She wondered if he wasted them in person. She arrived expecting silence. She got silence. She arrived expecting bleakness. She got something else. The ranch came into view as the wagon cleared the last line of trees, and Nora Caldwell, who had spent 23 years cultivating the armor of indifference, found herself gripping the wagon's side rail. The house was large and plain, built from the mountain itself, dark timber and stone, 2 stories, a porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Beyond it, a barn of similar construction, and beyond that the land opened into a high valley bowl ringed by peaks still white at their caps even in early summer. The grass was extraordinarily green. The sky was the kind of blue that seemed to have been invented for this particular elevation. In the middle distance, a small herd of horses moved slowly along the tree line, their dark shapes unhurried and purposeful, and the whole scene had a quality of absolute self-sufficiency that was either deeply lonely or deeply peaceful, and she could not yet tell which. A man was waiting on the porch. He was taller than she'd imagined and broader, and he stood with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be quiet in large spaces, dark hair going silver at the temples, a face that had been weathered by altitude into something spare and angular. His hands were in his coat pockets. He watched the wagon come without changing expression, and when Hobbs drew the horses up and she climbed down without waiting for assistance, she had learned to get down from wagons herself after the time she'd waited 3 minutes for a man to remember she was there. The rancher descended the porch steps and stopped a few feet from her. "Miss Caldwell," he said. "Mr. Calloway." He looked at her for a moment with an attention that was not rude, but was thorough, as though he were confirming something to himself. Then he said, "Hobbs will take your things in. Come inside. There's coffee." It was not a romantic overture. It was, she thought, the most purely functional greeting she had ever received. And because she had spent most of her life in rooms full of people saying elaborate things that meant nothing at all, she followed him inside with something that felt almost like relief. The kitchen was large and clean, and smelled of pine resin and coffee and the particular mineral cold of mountain air that seeped through even the best-built walls. He poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the table and sat across from her, and for a moment they simply drank, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual enough to notice. "I want to tell you something," he said, before any of the rest of it. She waited. "I won't pay your father what he's asked for you." He held the cup in both hands, looked at it rather than at her. "Not because I don't—" he paused. "Not for any reason that reflects on you. I don't pay bride prices. I won't purchase a person. That's a line I won't cross, and if you want to know the truth, I told him that before any arrangements were made." She stared at him. "He agreed to that?" "He wanted the connection," Calloway said. "He wants to tell people his daughter married a Calloway." The money mattered less than the name. He said it without contempt, just with the flat simplicity of a man describing terrain. Nora looked at her coffee. She thought of her mother in the best dress, the relief in that laugh. "All right," she said. "There's something else." He set down his cup. "You can stay a month. Work the ranch, see what this place is, decide what you think of it. If at the end of that month you want to leave, I'll give you a horse, a good one your own, and enough money to go wherever you want and start something for yourself. No obligation, no shame in it." He finally looked at her directly, and his eyes were a quiet gray-green, the color of the mountains in shadow. "I won't keep a person against their will either." She studied him for a long time. Outside, a wind had come up and was moving through the pine trees with a sound like distant water. "Why did you ask for me?" she said. "My family has 3 daughters. I'm the one they were glad to be rid of. Why specifically me?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She could tell the difference by now. She had known so many evasive men, but considering how to say something true. 3 years ago, he said, I was in Abilene for supplies. I was in the hardware district. I saw a merchant try to cheat an old man out of wages he was owed. Loading worker, been with him 10 years, the merchant just decided he didn't want to pay. He paused. There were maybe a dozen people standing around watching. Nobody said a word, and then a young woman walked into the middle of it and told the merchant, in front of everyone, exactly what he was and what he'd done, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not flinch. She told him the labor law, chapter and verse. She told the people watching what their silence made them, and the merchant paid. The kitchen was very quiet. "That was you," he said. It was not a question. Nora Caldwell felt something happen in her chest, some long-held architecture beginning, incrementally and against its will, to loosen. "I remember that day," she said carefully. "My mother told me I'd embarrassed the family." "I've been thinking about that woman for 3 years," he said simply. "When your father approached my solicitor, I asked questions until I was sure." He picked up his cup again. "I'm not a man who believes in doing things quickly." She did not know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to not knowing what to say. She looked out the kitchen window at the green valley and the white peaks and the slow-moving horses in the distance. "Tell me about the work," she said at last. "If I'm staying a month, I want to work. I'm not good at being ornamental." For the first time, something shifted in his face. It was not quite a smile. It was something quieter and more lasting. "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." The ranch ran on routine the way a watch runs on tension. Every day wound tight with purpose and released in careful intervals. She learned this in the first week without anyone teaching it to her explicitly, simply by watching how the place moved and inserting herself into its motion. There were 4 permanent hands. Lem, who was 60 and had been with Calloway since the beginning, 2 brothers named Ford and Cass who had come from Texas 3 years prior and regarded her arrival with the guarded neutrality of men who had learned not to form opinions quickly, and a young Mexican woman named Pilar who managed the house and the kitchen garden with an efficiency that bordered on art. Pilar said very little to her directly for the first 3 days, and then on the 4th morning found Nora already in the kitchen garden at 6 in the morning, dealing with a section of fence the deer had gotten through in the night, and said simply, "You know fences?" "I know wire," Nora said, "and I can learn fences." Pilar handed her the proper tool without further comment, and after that they worked beside each other in a companionable quiet that gradually, over days, became conversation. Calloway himself was everywhere and nowhere. She would see him at dawn crossing toward the barn, or late in the day riding the upper pasture fence, a silhouette against the evening sky so still he seemed painted there. He ate dinner at the same table as the hands, which surprised her the first night. Her father had never sat at the same table as anyone he employed, and he listened more than he talked, and when he did talk, it was about the ranch, about what needed doing, about the weather coming in from the northwest. He asked her, on the 3rd evening, what she thought of the water situation in the lower pasture, which was running clay-heavy from a spring runoff. And he asked it with the same directness he might use with any of the hands, and she gave him her opinion without softening it, and he considered it for a moment and said, "That's what I thought too," and went back to his meal. She had never in her life had her opinion received as simply as that. She worked. She worked in ways that surprised even herself, finding muscles she hadn't known existed and using them until they ached and using them again the next day anyway. She mended fence line in the upper pasture with Ford, who was taciturn but not unkind, and she learned to identify which sections of the grazing rotation were being overstressed, and she spent 2 days working with Lem on a water diversion that was silting up a lower creek. The work had a logic to it, a satisfaction she had never found in the accomplishments her family had wanted from her: embroidery, charm, the management of a social calendar. Here things broke and then they were fixed. The land needed something and then it was given. At the end of each day there was a visible record of the hours spent, and she found she was ravenous for that, for the tangible mark of effort, and she did not fully understand until the 2nd week that she had been hungry for it her whole life. On the 10th day, one of the mares foaled early and in difficulty, and it was Nora who was up and in the barn at 2 in the morning when it happened, because she had heard something in the mare's breathing that evening that concerned her, a quality of distress she could not have named but could not ignore. Calloway arrived 20 minutes later in his coat over his nightclothes, and he found her already there, talking quietly to the mare, her hands steady. They worked together through the small hours without speaking much, and when the foal finally came, dark and wet and indignant at the world's existence, and stood on its legs with a wobbling determination that felt, at 2:30 in the morning, like an argument against despair, Nora sat back against the stall wall and felt something move through her that was too large to name. Not sentiment, or not only sentiment, something older, something that had to do with effort and its rewards, with being exactly where usefulness required. She looked up and found Calloway watching her with that same expression she had begun to recognize, that quality of confirmation, as though she continued to be what he had believed she would be. "Go inside," he said quietly. "Get warm. I'll stay with them." She went inside. She got warm. She slept better than she had in years. She did not think about the end of the month often, but when she did, she thought about it differently than she had at the beginning. In the first days, the month had felt like a container, a finite and somewhat threatening shape she was moving through toward some unknown exit. By the 3rd week, she had stopped feeling the container's walls. She had stopped feeling like a visitor. She had caught herself, twice, thinking of the lower pasture as something she was responsible for, caught herself planning a 3rd week of work as though there would be a 4th, and the recognition of this was quieter and more complex than she'd expected. Not triumphant, but careful, a little frightened, the way it feels to discover something you want very much and understand for the first time that wanting it makes you vulnerable to losing it. She and Calloway had developed by the 3rd week a kind of daily conversation that moved around the edges of what mattered while slowly closing the distance to it. They talked about the ranch, about the land, about what he was trying to build here, which was something she had begun to understand was not merely a cattle operation, but a particular philosophy of how to work a place without consuming it. He had been watching this valley for 9 years, learning its tolerances, and he talked about this with a precision and a passion that was the most verbal she ever heard him, and she listened in a way she had rarely listened to anyone, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually following his thought to its end. She told him, one evening on the porch, about the merchant in Abilene, the full story. Not just the public event he'd witnessed, but what had preceded it, the old worker's face, the way the crowd had looked through him as though his distress were not quite visible, the particular anger she'd felt that was less about the injustice than about the invisibility, about the way power made some people simply not appear. She had never told anyone the full story. She had told it in her family as an embarrassment and in her own head as a justification, but she had never told it as what it actually was, which was something that had broken her open and shown her what she could not tolerate in the world. Calloway listened without moving. The evening was cooling around them, the last light leaving the peaks. "You weren't afraid?" he said when she finished. "I was afraid," she said. "I was furious. Fear and fury feel similar to me. Both make me move forward." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not a common thing," he said. "My family would say it's my defect." "Your family," he said carefully, "would be wrong." She looked at him then, in the particular light of the early mountain evening, and he was looking back at her. And the moment was so still and so charged that she felt the full weight of the 3 weeks behind them and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. And she looked away first, not from discomfort, but from the need to hold herself together a little longer. Her father arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks and 2 days into the month. She saw the wagon from the upper fence line and knew it was him from the way it was driven. Her father drove horses as he drove everything, with impatience and too much force, and the team was showing their discomfort in their ears. She came down the hill at her own pace and arrived at the yard to find him already out of the wagon and standing in the way of a man who has prepared a speech. "Nora," he said, "I've come to check on the arrangement." "The arrangement is fine," she said. He looked at the state of her. Work clothes, boots with real mud on them, her hair in a practical braid. His face went through several expressions. "You look like a ranch hand." "That's because I've been working as one." "What do you actually want, Father?" He glanced toward the house. "I want to speak with Calloway about the financial terms. He still hasn't sent the draft." "He told you he wouldn't?" "He told me he wouldn't pay a bride price," her father said, and his voice had the particular edge it got when money was being treated carelessly by people who did not understand what money was. "But there are other considerations. My expenses in the arrangement, the family's—" "There are no expenses the family incurred that I caused," Nora said. She kept her voice level. "I traveled on his money. The arrangement required no outlay from you. You're not owed anything." His face reddened. "You don't speak for this arrangement." "I speak for myself," she said. That was always the problem. He spent the rest of the afternoon finding Calloway and failing to reach a different conclusion. She did not witness the conversation. She went back to the fence line and finished the section she'd been working on because it needed doing, but Pilar told her later that Calloway had listened to her father for the full length of his argument, and then said without apparent heat that the terms were as he had stated them and would not change. Her father had left before dinner. He came back with the sheriff on Thursday. The charge was false, and everyone who knew Calloway knew it was false, which was a comfort that helped precisely nothing when they led him out of the barn in handcuffs on a Thursday morning because her father had filed a complaint claiming Calloway had defrauded him of the agreed bride price. The county sheriff was a man named Briggs, who was afraid of powerful men in direct proportion to their power, and her father had ridden to town and found a judge who owed him something, and the law moved in its crooked way, and Calloway was taken down the mountain without being permitted to send word. Nora stood in the yard and watched the wagon go and felt the cold fury move through her, and she thought of the worker in Abilene and the crowd that had looked through him, and she thought of fear and fury feeling similar, and she thought of moving forward. She saddled her own horse, the one Calloway had shown her the first week, a dark bay mare named Compass, who had learned by now which way Nora leaned on a rein, and she rode down the mountain alone. She had brought 3 things: the copy she had made of the original letter from Calloway's solicitor, which stated explicitly that no bride price had been agreed, the land records she had studied before arriving, which documented the scope of the ranch and its legitimacy, and the knowledge, which had taken 3 weeks to accumulate and which felt like the most solid thing she owned, of exactly who Elias Calloway was and what he was not. The county seat was 4 hours' ride. She made it in 3.5. She found the judge first. He was at dinner in the hotel, which was an inconvenience she declined to treat as a barrier. She walked into the dining room and sat down across from him and told him, in the same quiet voice she'd used with the merchant in Abilene, exactly what had happened and exactly what the documentation said, and she told him what she knew about the judge who had signed the arrest warrant, and she told him what she knew about her father's history of using legal instruments as business leverage, and she told him she had witnesses and records, and that if he chose not to act on what she was showing him, she would take the matter to the territorial capital, and she said all of this without raising her voice or flinching. The judge was a different kind of man than she'd feared. He read the solicitor's letter twice and looked at the records and was quiet for a moment, and then asked her if she had ridden down alone. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was complex in ways she didn't fully parse in the moment. "Wait here," he said. They released Calloway at 7 in the evening. She was waiting in the street outside the jail when he came out, and for a moment they simply stood there in the early dark, the street noise of the county seat moving around them, and his face in the lamplight was unguarded in a way she had not seen before. "You came down alone," he said. "Compass is a reliable horse." "Nora," he said and stopped. She had never heard him say only her given name before, without the title, without the formality, and the way he said it, with that particular weight and that particular care, settled something in her that she had not known was still unsettled. "You waited 3 years," she said. "It seemed wrong to let you sit in a cell any longer than necessary." He laughed then, a real laugh, quiet and surprised, something that had been waiting in him for a long time to come out, and the sound of it in the dark street seemed to her like something opening, some door in a house that had been shut a long time swinging out onto the air. They rode back up the mountain in the dark, side by side, mostly silent, the kind of silence that has become by then its own form of speech. They married on a Saturday morning in late June, in the yard of the ranch, with Pilar and the hands as witnesses and a traveling minister who had come through on his circuit and seemed genuinely pleased to officiate something that was, as he observed, clearly not a transaction. There were no flowers ordered from catalogs. There was no dress chosen to signal prosperity. Nora wore what she owned that was clean and good, and Calloway wore his dark coat, and they stood in the yard with the mountains around them and the valley below and the horses moving in the pasture in the middle distance, and they said what needed saying in plain words. And it was done. Pilar made a cake from what was in the kitchen, which turned out to be an excellent cake, and Ford played a fiddle he'd kept wrapped in his bedroll for 3 years without Nora knowing, and Lem told a story about the ranch's early days that went on considerably longer than anyone had expected, but which no one wanted to stop. Nora laughed at the story, genuinely, fully, the way she had trained herself out of laughing in her family's house, where a woman's laugh was judged for its propriety. The sound came out of her and filled the yard and went up into the open mountain air, and she felt it leave her the way something long held is released, the way a fist opens. She saw Calloway hear it. She saw him turn toward the sound, and something in his face settle into an expression that was not quite happiness, and was more than happiness. The expression of a man who has worked a long time toward something true and found it arrived exactly as hoped. Later that evening, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Pilar had retired and the house had grown quiet around them, Nora stood on the porch in the last light and looked at the valley and the peaks and the horses moving in the dimming pasture, and she understood something she had not had words for until now. She had spent 23 years being someone that a particular kind of world, small, afraid of itself, hostile to anything that did not fit the shape it had decided on, could not accommodate. She had been sold out of that world as a problem to be disposed of, and she had ridden out of it in a wagon expecting the worst, and she had arrived here. Here, where the work was visible, and the land was honest, and the silence meant thinking rather than erasure. Here, where a man had watched her do the right thing 3 years ago in a dusty street in Abilene, and had believed, on the evidence of that one moment, that she was worth waiting for. Here, where her fury was not a defect but a compass, where her stubbornness was not a failure, but a form of fidelity to things that mattered, where what her family had found impossible to manage had turned out to be, in a different context, exactly what was needed. The porch door opened and Calloway came out and stood beside her, and they looked at the valley together in the last of the light. "I want to put more fence on the north pasture," she said, "before the summer gets further along." "I know," he said. "I was thinking the same." The mountains went dark around them, slowly. peak by peak, and the first stars appeared over the western ridge, and from somewhere in the house behind them came the sound of the evening settling, the particular quiet of a place that had been waiting, for some time, for exactly this. She was home. She had not known, until now, that home was something you could ride toward through the mountains and find waiting at the other end, patient and real and entirely worth the journey. The cold, silent rooms of the Calloway ranch held the warmth of her now, held the shape of her laughter in their walls, and the house did not feel like the same house it had been in the long years before she came. It felt, at last, like what it had always been trying to become.